In April of 1945, Field Marshal Walter Model found himself standing inside a cellar of a farmhouse located somewhere within the Ruhr Valley, his ears tuned to the radio broadcasts coming through. American armor had them surrounded from every direction, north, south, and east, tanks as far as the strategic maps could show. Model's command, Army Group B, consisting of 325,000 soldiers and representing the largest remaining German military force in the Western Theater, was now completely encircled. With each passing hour, the encirclement tightened and the pocket of resistance grew smaller. Quotebast was his nickname, though that label carried the weight of a curse just as much as it served as a title of recognition. What it really meant was that Model was never handed a favorable situation to work with. They only summoned him after the structure was already engulfed in flames, half destroyed before he even arrived. By the time April of 1945 rolled around, the fireman had run completely dry of resources. He now stood at the very heart of a blazing catastrophe that he'd predicted and warned about for 8 solid months. The systematic breakdown that had enabled this dire situation to unfold, this devastating lightning-fast advance, which had completely shattered Germany's Western Front before any meaningful response could be mounted, had been orchestrated by the very commander Model had repeatedly cautioned Berlin about, George Patton. Model moved toward the window and gazed out at the horizon, where fires burned in the distance. He'd made it clear to his superiors that Patton operated differently from the others. His warnings had fallen on deaf ears. To truly grasp why Model was so significant, you need to comprehend what this man had already endured and lived through. The Eastern Front functioned as a relentless meat grinder, devouring German generals at the same horrifying rate it devoured their soldiers. Any commander who failed in his duties was promptly removed from his position. Those commanders who dared to retreat without explicit authorization faced court-martial. Model never experienced failure in his commands. Not once did he order a retreat without securing proper authorization first. Instead, he accomplished something of far greater value to the German war effort. He maintained his defensive position at Rzhev. Throughout 1942, Soviet military forces hurled wave after wave of offensives directly at Model's Ninth Army. Both sides suffered casualties that were absolutely staggering in their numbers. Soviet forces gave it a grim nickname, the Rzhev Meat Grinder. Model managed to hold that position for an incredible 14 months straight. During the Battle of Kursk in 1943, Model took command of the Northern Pincer in Germany's major offensive operation. When the offensive ultimately failed, Model's sector stood alone as the only one that didn't disintegrate into complete chaos. The disasters came flooding in after Kursk fell, first Army Group North, then Army Group Center. Whenever the Eastern Front crumbled under Soviet pressure, Berlin's high command dispatched Model to stabilize and hold the line. Soviet intelligence officers came to dread the moment they saw Model's name appear on their reports. His presence meant that what they'd anticipated as an easy breakthrough would transform into a brutal, grinding battle. By the time 1944 arrived, Model had made himself absolutely indispensable to the German war machine. He'd become the single general that Berlin's high command trusted to halt catastrophes in their tracks. On August 17, 1944, Model received orders that would ultimately define the last months of his existence. He was to report to France without delay. His mission, assume command of Army Group B, and somehow stabilize the collapsing Western Front. The situation he was walking into was nothing short of catastrophic, Allied forces had successfully broken through and escaped the Normandy confines. Patton's Third Army was tearing across the French countryside at breakneck speed. The Wehrmacht forces in the Western Theater were in complete, chaotic retreat. Model's predecessor in command, Field Marshal Günther von Kluge, had recently taken his own life. Suspected of participating in the July 20th plot to assassinate Hitler, von Kluge had chosen suicide over facing interrogation. When Model arrived at his new command, he discovered an army in absolute chaos. Military units were scattered across the landscape with no cohesion. Communication lines had been severed and rendered useless. Whole divisions had simply vanished from the order of battle, ceasing to exist as fighting units. Model staff officers assembled to brief him on the Allied command structure and the generals he'd be facing. In the north there was Montgomery, methodical, overwhelming in his approach, fully capable of executing devastating set-piece offensives. Holding the center was Bradley, a competent and steady commander who was methodically building up his strength. And then there was Patton, a category unto himself. Model leaned in closer to the map table. Quote 1, he said. His intelligence officers spread out the accumulated reports documenting Third Army's advance under Patton's command. The numbers they were showing him seemed impossible, almost nonsensical. Patton's forces had covered more than 400 miles in just 3 weeks of operations. His army alone had liberated more French territory than all the other Allied forces put together. His armored units were moving so fast they were actually outpacing their own supply lines. Model wasn't simply another general studying colored pins on a map. He was a seasoned professional watching a slow-motion catastrophe unfold before his eyes. Model quickly identified several distinct threats facing his command. Montgomery's enormous concentration of armored forces in the northern sector had the potential to launch a devastating set-piece offensive at any moment. The Allies' complete air superiority had made any daylight troop movement essentially suicidal. Chronic fuel shortages were crippling virtually every German operation they attempted to mount. But Patton represented something altogether different, something far more dangerous. Patton had a talent for striking precisely where German commanders didn't expect him. He identified and exploited weaknesses in German lines faster than commanders could mount any effective response. His grasp of mobile warfare was reminiscent of how Guderian and Rommel had understood it in Germany's glory days. Model sat down and drafted a comprehensive assessment to send to Berlin. In his analysis, Montgomery posed a danger due to his absolutely crushing logistical capabilities. Patton, however, was dangerous for an entirely different reason: his complete unpredictability. He conducted operations like a German panzer commander would have, not with the caution typical of Allied generals. Berlin's response was to focus their attention on Montgomery and to essentially leave Model's forces struggling against an American commander who refused to fight by conventional rules. When Berlin instructed him to focus on his own sector and leave strategic assessments to higher command, Model understood exactly what that directive meant. He was the only man in the room who could clearly see the wolf at the door, and yet the room had collectively chosen to leave that door standing wide open. By late August of 1944, Patton's Third Army had pushed all the way to the Meuse River. They were running 100 miles ahead of their projected schedule. German forces that were supposed to have time to establish defensive lines discovered Americans already positioned behind them. Units that calculated they had days to prepare their defenses found they had only hours remaining. Model watched the situation maps with a grim sense of satisfaction at his own foresight. Everything he had predicted was now happening exactly as he'd warned. Patton wasn't wasting time attacking German strong points. Instead, he was simply bypassing them entirely. He was racing toward the German border while other Allied commanders were still working to consolidate their positions in France. If Patton receives adequate fuel and supplies, Model warned Berlin in yet another report, he will be across the Rhine before winter arrives. The war could potentially end in 1944. This time, Berlin actually listened to his warnings, but not in the way Model had hoped they would. Instead of sending reinforcements to stop Patton's advance, Berlin decided the solution was to launch a massive offensive through the Ardennes region, catch the Americans completely by surprise, split the Allied armies apart, and capture the vital port of Antwerp. Model was ordered to begin planning what would eventually become known as the Battle of the Bulge. Before we continue with this story, I'm curious. Where are you watching this video from right now? Let me know in the comments below. December 16th, 1944. Model launched the offensive he had spent the previous months meticulously planning. Operation Watch on the Rhine. 3 full German armies attacking through the Ardennes forest. The assault achieved complete surprise. American defensive lines shattered during the initial assault phase. For the first 3 days of the operation, everything worked according to plan. German forces managed to advance 50 miles into Allied territory. American units found themselves surrounded and cut off at Bastogne and Saint-Vit. The bulge in the Allied line grew larger with each passing hour. For a few brief frozen days in December, Model allowed himself something that a German general in 1944 simply couldn't afford: hope. If they could somehow reach Antwerp, if they could successfully split the Allied armies in 2, perhaps the Western powers would be willing to negotiate some kind of settlement. But Model was also keeping a close watch on the southern flank of his offensive, watching and waiting for Patton. His intelligence officers reported back that Patton's Third Army was still actively engaged in operations 100 miles to the south. They calculated it would take Patton at least 2 full weeks to disengage from his current operations, completely reorient his forces, and then launch a full-scale counteroffensive against the German flank. Model wasn't so sure about those calculations. He had spent 4 months studying this particular American commander. He knew exactly what Patton was capable of achieving. December 19th, 1944. Just 3 days into the German offensive, Model received the intelligence report he had been quietly dreading. Patton's Third Army had disengaged from its operations in the Saar region. They were moving north, and they were moving fast. Model's staff officers carefully calculated the logistics of the movement. Patton was attempting to turn 3 full divisions 90 degrees and march them 100 miles through winter storms. Model shook his head when he read through the assessment. He told them flatly. On December 22nd, Patton's forces attacked the exposed German flank. They had pivoted their entire axis of advance in less than 72 hours, a logistical feat that German military planners had calculated would require at least 2 weeks to accomplish. As the reports continued to come in, Model's brief flicker of hope didn't just fade away. It curdled into something bitter. He realized in that moment that he wasn't playing a game of strategy anymore. He was serving as a witness to the impossible. 4 days later, on December the 26th, Patton's 4th Armored Division successfully broke through German lines to reach the surrounded 101st Airborne Division. The siege of Bastogne was lifted. German intelligence had calculated with confidence that Patton would need 2 weeks to mount an effective counteroffensive. He had attacked after just 3 days. He broke through their lines after 10. The relief of Bastogne transformed the Battle of the Bulge from a German offensive operation into a German disaster. Model tried desperately to continue the attack. He shifted forces between sectors. He adjusted operational objectives. He implemented every technique he had successfully used on the Eastern Front to salvage failing operations. But this wasn't the Eastern Front he knew so well. The Americans possessed complete air superiority. The Americans had virtually unlimited supplies at their disposal. The Americans had commanders who launched counterattacks before the enemy could even consolidate their gains. Within 2 weeks of Patton's counterattack, the Bulge had been completely eliminated. German forces were pushed back to their original starting positions. The offensive had cost Germany 100,000 casualties, men and equipment that couldn't possibly be replaced at this stage of the war. Model sent his after-action report back to Berlin. The assessment was bleakly honest. He wrote, Berlin's response was to blame Model for not advancing fast enough during the initial phase. By March of 1945, Model knew with certainty that the end was coming. The Allies had successfully crossed the Rhine at Remagen when American forces managed to capture a bridge intact. Within a matter of days, multiple bridgeheads had been established across the river. German forces in the west were being systematically split into isolated pockets. Patton's Third Army was racing across central Germany, moving so fast that entire German units were simply bypassed and left for follow-on forces to handle later. The sheer speed of the American advance made any organized defense virtually impossible. Model's Army Group B found itself pushed back into the Ruhr industrial region. The very area that Berlin had been so worried about protecting was now about to be completely surrounded. Model formally requested permission to attempt a breakout before the encirclement was complete. He could save the majority of his men if he was allowed to move immediately. Berlin refused his request. The Ruhr must be held at all costs. The industrial capacity must be preserved for the war effort. There would be no retreat authorized. Model had heard these exact orders before. On the Eastern Front, they usually came right before a complete catastrophe unfolded. April 1st, 1945. The trap finally closed shut. The U.S. First Army under General Courtney Hodges drove in from the south. The U.S. Ninth Army under General William Simpson swept down from the north. They linked up at Lippstadt, east of the Ruhr. Model's Army Group B, 325,000 German soldiers, was now completely surrounded in a pocket roughly 70 miles long and 55 miles wide. The capture of the Remagen Bridge had been the fatal blow to German defenses in the west. Once the Americans had secured a foothold across the Rhine, Germany's fate was essentially sealed. Patton's lightning advance had exploited that breach so effectively, shattering German defenses so completely that Hodges and Simpson were able to close the trap virtually unopposed. There would be no relief force coming. There would be no dramatic breakout attempt. The Wehrmacht had no reserves left to send anywhere. Model organized the defense of the pocket anyway, but he understood that the mathematics were utterly impossible. They had fuel measured in days, not weeks. Ammunition supplies were running dangerously low. Food stocks were almost completely gone. Model refused to issue a general surrender order to his trapped forces. He told his staff officers that a field marshal does not surrender. It simply isn't done. By mid-April 1945, the Ruhr pocket had fragmented into isolated groups of defenders. Model moved constantly between positions, avoiding capture, watching his doomed army disintegrate around him piece by piece. Units that had fought together for years simply stopped fighting. Men walked toward American lines with their hands raised in surrender. As Model watched his soldiers make the choice to surrender and live, he felt a strange, bitter sense of relief wash over him. He had spent years telling these men to hold their positions at all costs, to never surrender. Now he was watching them choose life, a choice he knew his own personal code of honor would never allow him to make for himself. He was watching the final collapse that Patton had made inevitable from the moment he crossed into Germany. His staff officers urged him repeatedly to surrender. They argued that the Americans would treat him well. They reminded him that he was a professional soldier who had commanded armies in the field, not someone who had run concentration camps. Model listened to their arguments but said nothing in response. He was thinking about two specific things. First, the collapse that had brought him to this moment, the American advance that had shattered the Western Front beyond any hope of recovery. And second, something much darker that weighed on his mind. The Soviets. Model understood all too well what surrender would actually mean for him personally. The Americans might treat him fairly as a prisoner of war, but the Americans were allies with the Soviet Union, and Model was very much a wanted man in Moscow. His scorched earth orders issued during operations on the Eastern Front. The massive devastation deliberately left behind during his strategic retreats. The Soviets maintained detailed lists of German commanders they wanted to put on trial for war crimes. Model's name appeared prominently on those lists. If the Americans captured him, there was a very real possibility they might hand him over to Soviet custody. The Soviets had already received other captured German prisoners for trial purposes. Model knew exactly what Soviet justice looked like firsthand. But there was something else weighing on him, something that went even deeper than fear of Soviet captivity. A field marshal does not surrender. That was the core of the Prussian military tradition that Model had been raised in since childhood. A commander does not hand his sword over to the enemy. A soldier does not become a prisoner if he has any other choice available to him. Paulus had surrendered at Stalingrad. Model remembered vividly what had happened to Paulus after that surrender. Captured by Soviet forces, paraded before Soviet cameras for propaganda purposes, living out his days in shame and dishonor. Model would not become another Paulus. He would not give them that satisfaction. After the war ended, Allied intelligence officers would conduct interviews with dozens of captured German generals. They wanted to understand which Allied generals the Germans had feared most during the campaign. When the questioning came around to Patton specifically, the answers from German commanders were remarkably consistent. General Hasso von Manteuffel stated that Patton understood armored warfare better than any other Western commander he'd faced. General Günther Blumentritt called him the most aggressive panzer leader on the Allied side. He was unpredictable in his movements. He moved faster than German commanders could react to his maneuvers. He fought like a panzer general from 1940, not like the cautious Allied commanders they had learned to anticipate and counter. When the interviewers asked specifically about Model's assessment of Patton, the surviving German officers confirmed what the historical record clearly showed. Model had identified Patton as uniquely dangerous as early as August 1944. He had repeatedly warned Berlin about the unprecedented speed of American operations under Patton's command. He had been largely ignored by the High Command. Model had been right about everything. And in April 1945, standing in that farmhouse surrounded by American forces closing in from all sides, He knew it with absolute certainty. Being right hadn't saved him from this fate. Being right hadn't saved anyone. April 21st, 1945. The pocket had shrunk to almost nothing. Model's last command post was a farmhouse completely surrounded by American forces. His army had ceased to exist as a functioning fighting force. Model called together his remaining staff officers for one final meeting. He told them he was officially dissolving Army Group B as a military formation. From this point forward, every soldier was free to make his own choice about what to do next. Surrender to the Americans, attempt to escape, whatever they wished to do. He was not issuing a formal surrender order. The Army Group would simply cease to exist as an entity. Then Model made a request of his officers. He asked them to end it for him, to shoot him so he wouldn't have to do it himself. The silence that filled that farmhouse in that moment was louder than the American artillery shells falling in the distance. Colonel Theodore Pilling and the other staff officers stood frozen in place. They could not bring themselves to do what their commander was asking of them. Model's request showed just how completely the American advance had broken him psychologically. There was nothing left for him but this final act. His war was over, and he had to walk the last few steps to the end by himself, alone. Model nodded when he saw they couldn't do it. He understood their position. He walked away from them out into the forest near Duisburg. He walked into a small thicket of trees where they could not see him from the farmhouse. A field marshal does not surrender to the enemy. A field marshal does not stand trial in a courtroom. A field marshal does not live out his days in shame and disgrace. Model ensured he would never be taken alive by enemy forces. Field Marshal Walter Model died in a forest near Duisburg on April the 21st, 1945. He was 54 years old. 17 days later, Germany surrendered unconditionally. History has a tendency to remember the victors of wars. And in 1945, German generals knew exactly who had beaten them decisively, the man who moved too fast for anyone to stop. Model had seen it coming for 8 solid months. In the end, it didn't matter that he'd been right. They called him the Fireman. He earned that name on the Eastern Front, stabilizing one disaster after another through sheer professional skill. But there was one fire he couldn't put out, the American advance that moved too fast for any defensive line to hold against it. In the end, Model chose death over surrender because of the Soviets who wanted him for war crimes, because of the Prussian tradition that a field marshal simply does not surrender, because living as a prisoner and a defendant in a courtroom was worse than dying as a soldier in a forest. Germany's best general made his final choice alone in a forest after his officers refused to help him end it. The fireman's work was finally over. The war ended 17 days later.